The story of Hurricane Katrina begins innocently enough, a blip on the radar screens of meteorologists tracking weather patterns in the vast Atlantic Ocean. At first, it was just another tropical disturbance, one of many that formed during the hurricane season. Meteorologists, however, knew that even the smallest systems could evolve into something much more significant. It was mid-August 2005 when a tropical depression, a disorganized swirl of clouds and rain, formed near the Bahamas. This initial formation was marked by sporadic thunderstorms and heavy rain, typical of early-stage tropical depressions. The system struggled to organize itself, battling wind shear and other atmospheric conditions. Little did anyone know this unassuming weather system would soon transform into one of the most devastating natural disasters in American history. As the days went by, the storm began to show signs of strengthening, its clouds becoming more organized and its winds picking up speed. As days passed, the storm, dubbed Katrina, gained strength, fueled by the warm waters of the Gulf of Mexico. The warm sea surface temperatures provided the energy needed for the storm to intensify, and it quickly grew from a tropical depression to a tropical storm and then to a hurricane. Meteorologists watched with increasing concern as Katrina's wind speed steadily increased. The storm's rapid intensification was alarming, and forecasters began to realize that Katrina could become a major hurricane. They monitored the storm's progress closely, using satellite imagery and computer models to predict its path and potential impact. The storm was evolving rapidly, developing the classic swirling eye and symmetrical structure of a powerful hurricane. This well-defined eye indicated that Katrina was becoming a formidable force, capable of causing widespread destruction. By August 26, Katrina had become a Category 3 hurricane, its winds whipping at over 111 miles per hour. The storm's intensity was now undeniable, and it was clear that it posed a serious threat to the Gulf Coast. The storm was on a collision course with the Gulf Coast, and the National Hurricane Center issued dire warnings of a potentially catastrophic event. These warnings urged residents to take immediate action to protect their lives and property. From Texas to Florida, coastal communities braced for impact, but the storm's ultimate target seemed to be the city of New Orleans, Louisiana. Residents began boarding up their homes, stocking up on supplies and making evacuation plans. New Orleans, known for its vibrant culture, musical heritage and unique location below sea level, was particularly vulnerable to a major hurricane. The city's geography made it especially susceptible to flooding, and the potential for disaster was high. Protected by a system of levees and flood walls, the city had long lived with the risk of flooding. These structures were designed to hold back the waters of the Mississippi River and Lake Pontchartrain, but they had never been tested by a storm of Katrina's magnitude. But Katrina, with its growing power and predicted storm surge, presented a threat unlike any before. The combination of high winds, heavy rain, and a massive storm surge had the potential to overwhelm the city's defenses and cause unprecedented damage. As Hurricane Katrina churned closer to the Gulf Coast, the warnings from meteorologists and public officials became increasingly urgent. The storm, already a Category 5 hurricane, was showing no signs of weakening, and the potential for catastrophic damage was becoming more apparent with each passing hour. The National Hurricane Center predicted a storm surge, the wall of water pushed ashore by a hurricane's force, of up to 28 feet. This was an unprecedented level of water that could inundate entire neighborhoods, sweeping away anything in its path. This surge, combined with the torrential rainfall expected, posed a grave threat to New Orleans, much of which lay below sea level. The city's unique geography with its levees and canals made it particularly vulnerable to such extreme weather events. On August 28, New Orleans Mayor Ray Nagin issued a mandatory evacuation order for the city, the first in its history. The decision was not made lightly, as it involved the displacement of hundreds of thousands of residents.
Residents were urged to seek higher ground and evacuate inland. The urgency in the mayor's voice underscored the severity of the situation, as he implored people to leave their homes and find safety. However, many faced agonizing decisions. For some, the thought of leaving behind everything they had worked for was almost unbearable. Evacuation meant leaving behind homes, possessions, and livelihoods. The emotional toll was immense, as families packed what they could and hoped for the best. For some, the cost and logistics of evacuation were insurmountable barriers. Not everyone had the means to leave, and the reality of their situation was heartbreaking.
Thousands of residents, particularly those without the means to evacuate, sought refuge in the Louisiana Superdome, a stadium built on higher ground. The Superdome was seen as a last resort, a place where people could find some semblance of safety. The Superdome, intended as a shelter of last resort, quickly filled with people seeking safety from the impending storm. The atmosphere inside was tense, as people braced for what was to come. Meanwhile, across the Gulf Coast, residents made their own calculations. Each family had to decide whether to stay and face the storm, or leave and risk the unknown. Some boarded up homes and businesses, hoping to ride out the storm. They fortified their properties as best they could, praying that their preparations would be enough. Others loaded up vehicles and joined the exodus inland, highways jammed with evacuees fleeing the coast. The roads were packed and the journey was slow and arduous. The atmosphere was thick with tension and uncertainty. Families were anxious, unsure of what the future held and whether they would have homes to return to. Hurricane Katrina, a monster storm bearing down on the Gulf Coast, was no longer a distant threat. It was a looming reality, a force of nature that could not be ignored. It was a terrifying reality, and the hours leading up to its arrival were a blur of frantic preparations and desperate prayers. People clung to hope, even as they faced the overwhelming power of the storm. On the morning of August 29, 2005, Hurricane Katrina, now a monstrous Category 5 storm with winds exceeding 175 miles per hour, slammed into the Gulf Coast. The sheer power of the storm was unlike anything the region had ever seen, with meteorologists warning of unprecedented destruction. The storm's initial impact was felt across a wide swath of the coastline, from eastern Louisiana to Mississippi and Alabama. The relentless winds and driving rain began to tear apart the landscape, leaving a trail of chaos in their wake. Coastal communities were battered by Katrina's fury, enduring howling winds, torrential rainfall, and a storm surge that swallowed entire neighborhoods. The once serene coastal towns were transformed into scenes of utter devastation. The full extent of the devastation would not be known for days, but early reports painted a grim picture. Emergency responders struggled to navigate the flooded streets and debris-strewn areas to reach those in need. Homes were reduced to rubble, their foundations ripped apart by wind and water. Families who had lived in these houses for generations found themselves homeless in an instant. Power lines lay tangled like fallen spiderwebs, plunging the region into darkness. The loss of electricity compounded the difficulties faced by the survivors, making communication and rescue efforts even more challenging. The storm surge, as predicted, proved to be catastrophic, inundating coastal areas and overwhelming levees and floodwalls. The sheer volume of water was more than the infrastructure could handle. In Mississippi, the storm surge reached a staggering 28 feet, obliterating homes and businesses along the coast. Entire communities were wiped off the map, leaving nothing but debris in their place. The casinos of Biloxi, once glittering symbols of the region's tourism industry, were reduced to piles of debris. The economic impact of their destruction would be felt for years to come. Across the state line in Alabama, Mobile Bay surged inland, flooding homes and businesses. The waters showed no mercy, engulfing everything in their path. But it was in New Orleans, Louisiana, where Katrina's impact would be most profound and heartbreaking. The city's levee system failed catastrophically, leading to widespread flooding and a humanitarian crisis of unprecedented scale. Section 4. The levee system fails, a city drowning under a sea of water. While the initial impact of Hurricane Katrina was felt across the Gulf Coast, it was the subsequent failure of the levee system protecting New Orleans that transformed the disaster into a tragedy of epic proportions.
The levees, earthen and concrete barriers designed to hold back the Mississippi River and Lake Pontchartrain, proved to be no match for Katrina's fury. As the storm surge pushed water into Lake Pontchartrain, the lake's water level rose at an alarming rate.
The levees, already strained by years of neglect and inadequate maintenance, began to crumble under the immense pressure. In several locations, the levees breached, sending torrents of water surging into the city.
The lower Ninth Ward, a predominantly African-American neighborhood, was particularly hard hit. A major breach in the Industrial Canal levee sent a wall of water crashing through the neighborhood, engulfing homes and businesses.
Within hours, much of New Orleans was submerged, transforming the once vibrant city into a toxic stew of floodwater, debris, and human misery. Section 5. Refuge in Chaos. The Superdome becomes a symbol of hope and despair. As New Orleans descended into chaos, the Louisiana Superdome, once a symbol of the city's spirit and resilience, became a beacon of hope for tens of thousands of stranded residents.
Initially intended as a shelter of last resort, the Superdome had swelled with evacuees in the days leading up to Katrina's landfall. With the city flooded and nowhere else to go, the Superdome transformed into a makeshift city within a city.
Inside the stadium, a sea of humanity huddled together, seeking solace and safety amidst the storm's aftermath. Families camped out on cots and blankets spread across the stadium floor, their belongings piled high around them.
However, the Superdome, ill-equipped to handle such a massive influx of people, quickly became overwhelmed. The air inside the stadium grew thick with the stench of sweat, urine, and human waste.
Food and water, initially in short supply, began to run dangerously low. Medical supplies dwindled, and the cries of sick children echoed through the cavernous stadium. Section 6, A Sea of Needs, Stranded Survivors. Face hunger, thirst, and desperation. In the days following Katrina's landfall, the situation inside the Superdome and across New Orleans deteriorated rapidly.
With the city flooded and communication lines down, stranded residents faced a growing humanitarian crisis. Food, water, and medicine were in critically short supply.
The heat and humidity inside the Superdome became unbearable, exacerbating the suffering of those trapped inside. Tempers flared as desperation mounted, and the stadium, once a symbol of hope, began to descend into chaos.
Outside, the situation was even more dire. Residents trapped on rooftops or clinging to scraps of debris waved desperately for help. The floodwaters, a toxic soup of sewage, oil, and debris, posed a serious health risk.
The elderly and infirm, unable to escape the rising waters, perished in their homes. Looting and violence erupted in some areas, a testament to the desperation and lawlessness that gripped the city.